I'll never forget the first time I crossed paths with the legendary HOA Karen. It was one of those mild spring mornings, and I had just stepped outside to admire the fresh dew on the lawn when I saw her marching up my driveway with the determined gait of someone who'd spent their life commanding others. Her hair was rigidly coiffed. She clutched a clipboard like a weapon, and she had the expression of a medieval king about to banish a peasant. Right away, my stomach twisted. "Excuse me," she snapped, not even waiting for me to say hello. "Are you the homeowner?" I nodded cautiously, taking her in. I was well aware of who she was. My neighborhood's newly elected HOA board member, infamously nicknamed Karen for her flair for public tantrums. She was the type who wrote lengthy, scolding letters if a mailbox wasn't painted the right shade of taupe. "I'm David, yes," I said, mustering a cordial tone. "Can I help you?" She glanced over my shoulder, eyes narrowing at something in my driveway. I turned slightly and saw that she was fixated on my camper, an older model travel trailer I bought a few years ago for cross-country road trips with my wife, Kate, and our 2 grandkids when they visited. "This is a violation," Karen declared, jabbing a finger at it. "RV or camper vehicles must be stored off-site in accordance with Hawthorne Park HOA bylaws, paragraph 14, section B. I suppressed a sigh. "Actually," I said, "my reading of the bylaws says I can have it on my property as long as it's behind the fence line, out of view from the street." She glared, flipping through pages on her clipboard. "That's not my interpretation," she snapped. "Regardless, we've had complaints from neighbors. That thing is unsightly and brings down the neighborhood's curb appeal." I wanted to tell her that the camper was barely visible from the road unless you craned your neck at just the right angle. But I bit my tongue and instead offered, "I'm open to discussing the matter at the next HOA meeting. I've got paperwork of my own that supports my position." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "You can discuss it, but the board might not be as forgiving as I am. Just move it off the property if you want to avoid a fine." She turned on her heel, marched back to her car, and drove off, leaving me with a sense of foreboding in the pit of my stomach. That evening, I told Kate about our new, friendly neighbor. She laughed grimly. "I've heard about her," she said. "She's the same one who made the Smith family take down their string lights last Christmas because they weren't pre-approved by the HOA. She might be more trouble than she's worth." I shrugged. "We'll see what the next meeting brings. If the bylaws allow it, we have every right to keep the camper here." Over the next few days, Karen escalated her campaign. Flyers appeared on mailboxes throughout the neighborhood, reminding everyone of vehicle storage rules. During my morning walks, neighbors gave me sympathetic smiles, as though they already knew she'd single me out. One even whispered, "Better watch out. She'd been calling the towing company on people who park too close to fire hydrants." I'd never had a run-in with an overzealous HOA enforcer before, but I wasn't about to cave in without reviewing the actual regulations. I rummaged through my old files and found the Hawthorne Park HOA handbook, dog-eared but intact. Sure enough, it said nothing about a camper being disallowed if parked behind the homeowner's fence and out of general view. I highlighted the relevant passage, feeling confident I had the facts on my side. At the next HOA meeting, held in a cramped room at the community clubhouse, I presented my case. Karen glared at me from her seat up front. Lips pursed so tightly they seemed to disappear into her face. 2 or 3 other board members listened politely as I read the exact wording of the bylaw. Some folks in attendance murmured that my camper shouldn't be a big deal. A few even expressed interest in having a similar setup for summer trips. Karen, however, was not amused. She flipped through her own binder and attempted to present a contradictory interpretation. It didn't land, mostly because it was clear to everyone else that the bylaw's language supported my position. Finally, another board member, a pragmatic man named Allen, said, "Karen, I think David has the right to keep the camper as long as it's behind the fence." That's how I read the bylaw, too. With a stone-faced scowl, Karen was forced to yield. But as I left the meeting, I caught her cold stare trailing after me. It was the kind of look that said, "This isn't over." And it wasn't, because just a week later, I discovered the towing notice on my camper's windshield. Yes, my camper's windshield, warning me that it was parked in violation of HOA regulations and could be removed at any time. It didn't matter that we'd publicly established my right to keep it there. Karen was on a mission, and she had apparently found a towing company willing to partner with the HOA to remove offending vehicles. I took the notice inside, showing Kate. She shook her head in disbelief. How can she do that? She's ignoring her own board decision. I decided to pay the towing company a visit. I spoke to a representative who insisted they were acting under official direction from the HOA. We have a contract, they said. If we see a violation, we're authorized to tow. But there is no violation, I argued. You'll be trespassing if you do anything. The rep shrugged. That's between you and the HOA. We're just enforcing. I walked away seething, uncertain what Karen would try next. I didn't realize just how far she'd go, or how spectacular it would backfire, until the day she came roaring down the street, towing truck in tow, determined to haul off my camper for good. Tensions came to a head on a Tuesday afternoon. One of those brisk, sunny days that make you want to sit out on the porch with a book. I was inside, sorting through some old tools, when I heard the rumble of a heavy engine outside. Peeking through the window, I saw a flatbed tow truck inching its way down the street, hazard lights flashing in broad daylight. Behind it, like a queen in a chariot, was Karen in her glossy silver SUV. She drove slowly, making sure everyone saw her leading this grand procession. My heart pounded. I had a sinking feeling that this was it. The day she tried to tow my camper, rightful ownership, and HOA rules be damned. Sure enough, the tow truck pulled into my driveway. The driver hopped out, wearing a bored expression as if this was just another run-of-the-mill job. Karen parked on the street and stormed up. I stepped onto my front porch, forcibly calm. What's going on here? I demanded, voice tight. We're towing your illegally parked camper, Karen announced, with the righteous tone of someone reading a decree. She gestured at the driver, who moved to unhook some chains and get ready to do the deed. That camper is not illegally parked, I said, stifling the anger in my chest. We went over this at the HOA meeting. It's behind the fence within regulations. Karen folded her arms, unwavering. I have multiple complaints from neighbors about that eyesore. The board may have concluded one thing, but as an HOA official, I'm making an executive decision for betterment of the community. Before I could respond, my neighbor Martin ambled over from across the street. He was a middle-aged guy with a friendly demeanor, and I'd chatted with him a few times about our love of fishing. He looked puzzled. Karen, I can't imagine who complained, he said, gesturing around the quiet street. No one can even see that camper from the road unless they go poking around. Karen shot him a look that could curdle milk. That's not your concern. Now, please back away and let the towing company do their job. The driver began lowering the flatbed. My temper flared. You are trespassing, I told him, stepping off my porch. You have no right to remove my property without a valid order. The HOA does not have the authority to override the board decision or the community bylaws. He hesitated, glancing between me and Karen. Ma'am, he said uncertainly, are you sure? Karen thrust her clipboard at him. We have a contract. Tow it. Now. I was about to dial the police when a sudden wail of sirens cut through the air. My heart leapt. An ambulance? A fire truck? I glanced up the street. Instead, around the corner came a police cruiser, lights flashing. Someone must have called them. Maybe Martin or another concerned neighbor. The officer, a tall woman with a no-nonsense expression, stepped out, hand resting on her belt. Everything okay here? She asked, scanning the scene. Karen marched over, practically shoving her clipboard into the officer's face. Officer, this camper is illegally parked in violation of our HOA rules. We have a contract with the towing company, and this man is obstructing us. The officer turned to me, eyebrows raised. Sir, I explained the short version. The bylaw allowed my camper as long as it was behind the fence line. The HOA board had already ruled it was acceptable, and I believe Karen was acting on her own vendetta. Martin chimed in, backing me up. The tow truck driver looked more confused by the second. The officer asked Karen if she had official documentation signed by the board, something that explicitly overrode the prior ruling. Karen's face flushed a deep shade of red. "The board can't micromanage every decision," she snapped. "I have the right to enforce community standards." The officer stepped aside, made a quick phone call, likely verifying the HOA's stance. A few minutes later, she returned with a stony expression. "Ma'am," she told Karen, "it appears there's no official board directive for towing this camper. In fact, the HOA regulations permit it. If you proceed with towing, it could be considered unauthorized removal of property and potential trespassing." Karen's jaw went slack. The tow truck driver muttered something about not wanting any trouble, then slowly started to raise the flatbed back into place. The entire fiasco ended with Karen storming back to her SUV, slamming the door and screeching off in fury, followed by the tow truck driver, who seemed relieved to be leaving. As the police cruiser pulled away, Martin and I exchanged a small cheer, but I knew Karen wouldn't let this go. She was the type to double down. And I was right. Just 2 days later, I heard from a different neighbor that Karen was planning something even more drastic. "She's bragging," the neighbor said, shaking his head. "Something about getting you in trouble with city ordinances. Says she's got a friend at City Hall." I dreaded the possibility of another battle, but life went on. Days passed quietly. I even managed to push Karen to the back of my mind, hoping she'd realize how thoroughly she'd been outvoted. Then, on an otherwise normal Wednesday, the real chaos hit. Except this time, Karen's towing crusade would backfire in the most spectacular way imaginable. I was out for a walk with Kate when we saw the same tow truck turning onto our street. Instantly, my pulse jumped. "She's back," I muttered to Kate, pointing. But as we quickened our pace, we realized the truck was heading toward the opposite end of the block, not my house. Karen's SUV was behind it, hazard lights on. She hopped out and started yelling orders at the driver. Confused neighbors peeked out their windows. At first, I couldn't see what exactly she was targeting. Some car parked on the street, another camper. Then, through the swirl of confusion, I heard a loud crunch of metal chains. "That's not your," a voice shouted, but was drowned by Karen's screech. "Tow it!" Kate and I broke into a jog, rounding the corner in time to see the tow truck hooking up to a silver sedan, one I didn't recognize at all. It definitely wasn't my car, nor did it belong to any immediate neighbor I knew. Karen was ranting about violations, improper parking, and eyesores. She was so fixated on playing towing queen that she didn't seem to notice the driver's growing alarm or the murmurs of bystanders. Then, as if on cue, a frantic-looking man came running out of a nearby house, waving his arms. "Wait! That's my rental car," he yelled. Karen ignored him, ordering the driver to hurry up, and that's when the real trouble began. The scene was pure chaos. Karen, brimming with self-importance, was barking at the tow truck driver to continue hooking up the sedan. Meanwhile, this bewildered homeowner, a guy in his late 30s named Luke, was frantically trying to explain that the car belonged to a friend visiting from out of town, or maybe it was a rental he was using while his own vehicle was in the shop. At that point, adrenaline was surging and the details were fuzzy. Regardless, it was crystal clear that the silver sedan didn't belong to me or have anything to do with my camper. Karen had apparently gotten her wires crossed. So fixated on towing someone's vehicle that she either made an error or simply didn't care whose it was. Luke managed to dart in front of the tow truck, hands raised. "You can't take this," he shouted. "It's parked legally in front of my house." Karen let out an exasperated growl. "No, it isn't. This is the vehicle I had a complaint about. Some neighbor told me it was an unauthorized camper." Her face twisted in confusion, as if realizing how absurd that sounded. Then, eyes darting around, she tried to regain her composure. "I meant, it's a violation of HOA policy to store a vehicle on the street for more than 72 hours. Luke's frustration turned to fury. "This hasn't even been here for 24 hours. I just got back from the airport." By now, several neighbors were gathering, drawn by the commotion. I arrived with Kate, standing at the periphery, heart pounding. Part of me wanted to intervene, but another part felt like I was witnessing karmic justice in real time. The tow truck driver, a stocky man with a weary expression, glanced at Karen. "Ma'am, if this is the wrong vehicle, I can't just tow it. That's illegal. Karen's cheeks burned. It's not the wrong vehicle. I have an HOA complaint right here. She tapped her clipboard but looked suddenly uncertain, as if she was realizing she'd gone after the wrong target. She'd come here presumably to tow my camper for a second time, but since it wasn't accessible and likely locked behind my fence, she latched onto the first car that seemed suspicious to her. Luke thrust his insurance papers at the tow truck driver, then pointed out the legal parking zone markings on the curb. "Look," he said, voice thick with anger. "I'm not violating anything. This is a public street. You have no right." The driver held up his hands defensively. "I'm not towing anything that's legally parked," he said. "Ma'am, if you have an official directive from the city or the HOA board, show it now. Otherwise, I'm out." Karen's eyes flicked at the growing crowd, and I could see the panic. She'd lost face in front of everyone, including the same neighbors she supposedly represented. All she managed was a feeble, but the complaint said a silver. There was supposed to be a large, ugly vehicle. At that moment, as if fate decided to twist a knife, the actual car of the alleged violation, a beat-up old pickup truck, it turned out, came rolling by on its way out of the neighborhood. The driver slowed, gawking at the spectacle of the tow truck. Karen locked eyes on the truck, mouth agape, realizing too late that was likely the vehicle she'd received complaints about. The tow truck driver followed her gaze, then shook his head in exasperation. "Unbelievable," he muttered, climbing back into the cab. "I'm done here." With that, he revved the engine and began to drive away. Karen was left standing there, clipboard clutched tight, as a chorus of neighbors snickered or whispered among themselves. Luke stepped forward, shaking with anger. "You just tried to steal my car. You can't do that. I'm calling the police." Karen's composure snapped. She whipped around and sneered. "I am the HOA. I have every right to enforce the rules. If you park illegally again, we will remove your car." "It's not illegal," Luke retorted, pulling out his phone. "You just watch how this plays out." The tension was thick enough to slice with a knife. Karen's chest heaved as if she was about to explode again, but the eyes of everyone on the street were on her. Even I felt a twinge of pity. She'd gone too far, too publicly, and there was no graceful exit. She marched back to her SUV, slammed the door, and screeched off with tires squealing, leaving Luke and the rest of us in stunned silence. Kate stepped up beside me, mouth slightly open. "Did that just happen?" she whispered. I nodded, exhaling a shaky breath, and I didn't even have to lift a finger. Within minutes, Luke was on the phone to the non-emergency police line, explaining that an HOA representative had attempted to tow his perfectly legal rental car. The operator said they'd send someone out to take a report. It wasn't long before a squad car showed up, and Luke gave his statement in detail. A couple of other neighbors corroborated. I chimed in, explaining the background with Karen's repeated towing threats. The officer calmly took notes. "Sounds like a civil matter," he said, though he sympathized. "We can't arrest someone for calling a tow, but if the HOA is repeatedly overstepping, you might consider civil action or complaint to the board, especially if there's a pattern." Luke was visibly rattled. He thanked the officer and then turned to me. "Is this the same woman who tried to tow your camper?" he asked. I nodded. "She's got a vendetta." He shook his head in disbelief. "I just moved here a few months ago. People warned me about the HOA, but I never expected something this ridiculous." Neighbors lingered, venting their shared frustration. Some complained about Karen's random violation notices, others about petty citations for minor things like leaving trash bins on the curb an hour too long. The fiasco had turned into a spontaneous community meeting right there on the sidewalk. Before long, someone suggested we all gather at my place that evening. No official HOA business, just neighbors comparing notes, maybe brainstorming how to handle Karen. It was a bit unusual, but I agreed. The tension in the neighborhood was palpable, and folks wanted to come together. That night, about a dozen of us crowded into my living room, chatting over coffee and pastries Kate had laid out. People shared stories of Karen's overreach, fines for harmless landscaping choices, threats about house paint colors, unwarranted safety inspections. One elderly couple recounted how Karen demanded they remove a small bird feeder in their yard, claiming it attracted unwanted pests. As we talked, a plan began forming. We realized that the HOA board itself had never granted Karen the unilateral power she was wielding. In fact, the board president was a fairly reasonable person. Karen was simply muscling her way around, pretending to have more authority than she did. "Let's all attend the next official meeting and voice our concerns," Martin proposed. "We'll present a united front. They can't ignore all of us." There was a chorus of agreement. Luke declared he'd file a formal complaint about Karen's attempted towing of his car. Another neighbor said she'd do the same regarding an unwarranted fine. Finally, we decided we'd collectively speak to the board president, Alan, one-on-one if necessary. Let him know the extent of Karen's harassment. "They need to rein her in," Luke said, still seething from the day's events. "Or else the police will be getting more calls." When everyone left, I felt a strange mixture of relief and anticipation. On one hand, Karen's tyrannical behavior was pushing the entire neighborhood to unite. On the other, I knew she wouldn't go down without a fight. If she was bold enough to try towing my camper and ended up almost towing the wrong car, who knew what stunt she'd attempt next? But I also knew something else. She had publicly humiliated herself this time. People had seen her meltdown, had heard her erroneous complaints, and had watched her run away when it all blew up in her face. Her credibility was in tatters, and even the most docile neighbors were fed up. It wasn't a matter of if we could stop Karen's power trip. It was a matter of when 2 weeks later, the night of the HOA meeting arrived. The buzz in the community was electric. Word had spread about Karen's failed tow escapade, and a record number of residents showed up, more than I'd ever seen. The usual row of empty chairs was completely occupied, with some people standing along the back wall. Everyone seemed on edge, as if expecting fireworks. The board president, Alan, tried to maintain a calm demeanor as he opened the meeting. He seemed taken aback by the turnout and even joked, "Wow, we might have to rent a bigger room if we keep this up." But the room was too tense for laughter. Karen was seated in her usual spot at the board's table, clipboard in front of her, face set in stone. She darted glances around, likely aware that she was the reason so many people were here tonight. After the usual housekeeping and reading of the last meeting's minutes, Alan opened the floor for community concerns. Immediately, Luke stood up. He described in clear detail how Karen had tried to tow his lawfully parked car, provided no official documentation, and left him scrambling to explain the matter to the police. He demanded an explanation from Karen and an apology. A wave of murmurs passed through the audience. Karen stared at Luke coldly, then tried to deflect. "I was acting on a complaint. I have a duty to enforce HOA rules." Luke shot back. "And which rule exactly did my car violate?" "Because the police found no issue, and neither did the actual HOA bylaws." Karen flipped through her papers, red creeping up her neck. "It might have been a misunderstanding," she muttered. "I had reason to believe the vehicle was abandoned. We get many complaints about that." A neighbor chimed in from the back. "Was it also a misunderstanding when you tried to tow David's camper, even after the board decided it was allowed?" All eyes turned to me. I stood, clearing my throat. "Yes," I said. "Karen called a tow truck to remove my camper, which was parked in full compliance with the bylaw. The police had to intervene. She was overstepping her authority." An older woman, Ms. Delgado, rose next. She held up a letter. "Karen sent me this warning about excessive grass height. I measured it myself. It was less than 4 inches, which is within regulation. Yet I was threatened with fine." One by one, residents stood to share their grievances. Some were small, others more serious. The common thread was clear. Karen was issuing violations without board approval or any legitimate basis. Alan tried to keep order, but the tension was palpable. Finally, he raised a hand. "All right, let's all settle down." He turned to Karen, looking frustrated. "Karen, as a board member, you know we have procedures. If a complaint is lodged, it should be reviewed by the board, or at least documented properly. These stories suggest you acted independently, without verifying claims." Karen stood, bristling. "No one else on the board is willing to enforce the community standards. We have guidelines for a reason. If I see something that looks out of place, I address it. We can't wait for a bureaucratic process every time. Alan rubbed his temples. That's not how this association is supposed to work. We have committees. We have official channels for complaints. You can't just bring in a tow truck or threaten neighbors on a whim. A wave of applause and murmured agreement spread through the room. Feeling the momentum, Luke stepped forward again. I'm formally requesting the board to take disciplinary action against Karen for misuse of authority. The air crackled with anticipation. This wasn't a typical HOA meeting anymore. It was a referendum on Karen's entire approach. Even those who'd once given her the benefit of the doubt seemed fed up. Alan looked around, his gaze taking in the nodding heads. The board will discuss this. Karen, we'll need you to step out for that portion. Karen's eyes widened in disbelief. You can't be serious. But Alan's tone was firm. I'm sorry, but we need an executive session to handle this formally. With a baleful glare at the crowd, Karen gathered her papers and stalked out of the room. The energy was electric. People whispering among themselves. We could hear muffled voices from inside as the board debated. It felt like an eternity, but was probably just 15 minutes before Alan and the others emerged. Karen was conspicuously absent. Alan cleared his throat, addressing everyone. We've reviewed the complaints, and we feel there's enough evidence to show that Karen acted beyond her authorized duties. Effective immediately, she's been removed from any enforcement role within the HOA. She will remain on the board only until the next election, at which point she may choose to run again, or not. Until then, she has no unilateral enforcement powers. A low murmur spread across the room. Some people clapped, while others just looked relieved. I glanced at Luke, and we exchanged satisfied nods. Finally, it felt like we had justice. Over the next few weeks, the atmosphere in the neighborhood lifted. Karen still lived there, of course, but her iron grip on petty violations vanished. People felt freer to chat outside, decorate their yards, and relax about every small infraction. Luke never got a personal apology from Karen, but he didn't seem to care. He was just glad he didn't have to worry about his car being towed. As for my camper, it stayed happily behind the fence, untouched. Karen would drive by sometimes, her mouth set in a grim line, but she no longer had the towing company on speed dial. The neighborhood had effectively stripped her of that power. Interestingly, after Karen's fall from grace, Alan quietly told me that the board had grown tired of her tactics for a while. She's been stirring the pot with misguided citations and complaints, he confided. But we needed the community to speak up before we could take decisive action. Thanks for not backing down. I simply nodded, recalling how close we'd come to my camper being towed away on a false claim. If not for the police intervention, I might have lost thousands of dollars or wasted days retrieving it. Karen's overreach turned out to be her undoing. Luke often jokes that Karen's biggest blunder was towing the wrong car. In a bizarre way, it united the neighborhood against her. Had she not messed up so spectacularly, maybe she could have continued harassing people one violation at a time. But by mixing up a sedan for my camper, she showed the entire community just how reckless she was. Today, life in Hawthorne Park is mostly peaceful. A new towing policy has been established that requires full board approval before any vehicle can be removed. A committee was formed to handle complaints, ensuring no single person can run amok. And Karen? She's still around, but she keeps her head down now, rarely attending community events. Word is she plans to move before the next HOA election. No one expects her to run again. Sometimes neighbors still tell the story at barbecues or in the local diner, how the HOA Karen got so obsessed with towing my camper that she ended up towing a total stranger's car instead, nearly costing the HOA a lawsuit and definitely costing her the last shred of respect she had in the neighborhood. And if that's not the ultimate entitled HOA horror story, I don't know what is. The end.